The train left the processing facility in New Jersey on a Tuesday morning in October 1944, and for the first hour nobody spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the window was there, and America was outside it, and everything outside it was wrong. Wrong in the way a number is wrong when it does not match the column it belongs to. Wrong in the way a report is wrong when the figures refuse to confirm what the summary already concluded. The women pressed against the glass in the gray morning light and watched a country scroll past that bore no resemblance to the country they had been taught existed. Not in the newsreels, not in the briefings, not in 6 years of careful, consistent, confident instruction about what the enemy looked like and how close it was to breaking. It was not breaking. It was not even bending. Brunhild Newman sat in the third row of the passenger car with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window and felt, for the first time since her capture, something she did not immediately have a word for. It was not fear. She had been afraid before and knew its specific weight. It was not relief. It was something quieter and more unsettling than either. The particular sensation of a person who has just opened a ledger and found that every figure she spent years recording was built on a number that was never true. Outside the window, America continued. It had no interest in what she believed. The train left the processing facility in New Jersey on a Tuesday morning in October 1944, and for the first hour nobody spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the window was there, and America was outside it, and everything outside it was wrong. Wrong in the way a number is wrong when it does not match the column it belongs to. Wrong in the way a report is wrong when the figures refuse to confirm what the summary already concluded. The women pressed against the glass in the gray morning light and watched a country scroll past that bore no resemblance to the country they had been taught existed. Not in the newsreels, not in the briefings, not in 6 years of careful, consistent, confident instruction about what the enemy looked like and how close it was to breaking. It was not breaking. It was not even bending. Brunhild Newman sat in the third row of the passenger car with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window and felt, for the first time since her capture, something she did not immediately have a word for. It was not fear. She had been afraid before and knew its specific weight. It was not relief. It was something quieter and more unsettling than either. The particular sensation of a person who has just opened a ledger and found that every figure she spent years recording was built on a number that was never true. Outside the window, America continued. It had no interest in what she believed. They had been captured 6 weeks earlier, in France, when the Wehrmacht communications unit Hilda worked for had been overrun so quickly that there had been no time for the dignified end anyone had quietly imagined. One morning there were orders and maps, and the familiar machinery of military administration. By afternoon there were American soldiers in the corridor, and an officer telling them in serviceable German to step away from the desks and put their hands where he could see them. Hilda had put her hands up and thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that the column she had been filling in would now go unfinished. The weeks that followed were a blur of processing, waiting, and the slow education of captivity. A holding camp in France. Then transport to England. Then a ship across the Atlantic that was larger and better maintained than anything she had expected, staffed by sailors who moved with the energy of men who were not hungry, which was itself a kind of information she filed away, without yet knowing what to do with it. Now there were 5 of them in this car, selected from the larger group for transfer to a permanent camp in the interior. 5 women from different units, different cities, different versions of the same 6 years. Ingrid Schultz sat directly behind Hilda, spine straight, chin level, watching the window with the focused attention of someone determined to find the flaw in what she was seeing. She was 28 years old, had run a BDM district in Nuremberg before her auxiliary posting, and carried her ideology the way some people carry religion, not as a conclusion reached, but as the ground beneath her feet, the thing that made standing possible. Liesel Braun sat across the aisle with her face almost against the glass, her breath fogging a small circle on the surface that she wiped away periodically with her sleeve. She was 19, a typist from a village near Stuttgart who had never been further from home than Munich before the war, and she watched America with the wide and slightly helpless attention of someone for whom everything was simply new. Marta Hoffman sat 2 rows back, her forearms on her knees, her eyes moving between the window and the floor in a rhythm that suggested she was alternating between looking and thinking. She was 42, from a farm east of Leipzig, and she had the quality of a person who processed the world through her hands first and her conclusions later. Ruth Winger sat at the back of the group, as she always did, watching everything without appearing to watch anything. She was 35, a nurse, and she had the economical stillness of someone who had spent years in rooms where panic was not permitted. Their escort was a young American corporal named Danny Marsh, who spoke German with the determined imprecision of a man who had learned it from a textbook and a dictionary and was doing his best with both. He sat near the door of the car with his clipboard and his mild expression and appeared, as far as Hilda could determine, entirely unbothered by the responsibility of transporting 5 enemy prisoners across a country she was only now beginning to understand was very large. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the US you are watching this video. It was Liesel who broke the silence first, because Liesel almost always did. "Those buildings," she said, not to anyone in particular, her voice low and slightly uncertain. "They are not damaged." No one answered immediately. Outside, the outskirts of a city were giving way to suburbs, rows of houses with glass in every window, cars in the driveways, yards with grass that had been cut recently. A woman was hanging laundry on a line between 2 posts. A child was riding a bicycle on a footpath beside the road. "Of course they are not damaged," Ingrid said, from behind Hilda. "The war is not here." "I know that," Liesel said. "I only mean, it looks so normal." "What did you expect?" Ingrid asked. Liesel thought about this for a moment. "I don't know exactly. Something harder. Something that looked like a country at war." Marta spoke from the back, without looking up from the floor. "Germany looked like a country at war too, at the beginning. Before the bombs." The sentence landed, and stayed where it fell. Nobody disputed it. Hilda said nothing. She was counting. It was what she did when her mind needed something to hold on to. She counted, she measured, she looked for the figures that would tell her where the truth was. She counted the cars in the driveways as the suburbs passed. 1 per house, mostly. Some had 2. The houses were not large, but they were intact and maintained, with painted window frames and swept porches, and in several cases small kitchen gardens still producing something green in the October chill. She had managed food allocation records for a Munich district cooperative for 3 years. She knew what a neighborhood looked like when it was rationed, when it was cutting portions, when the gap between what a population needed and what it had was beginning to show in the texture of daily life. She had seen that texture develop in Germany over 6 years, so gradually that it had almost seemed natural. This did not have that texture. This had the texture of a place that had not yet been asked to give anything up. By mid-morning, the city had dissolved entirely into countryside, and the countryside was doing something that Hilda found quietly difficult to absorb. It was simply going on. Field after field, farm after farm, each with its outbuildings and equipment, and the particular organized calm of land being properly maintained. Grain silos caught the thin, autumn light. Cattle moved in near pastures. A tractor traced a line through a harvested field, turning the soil for the next season with the unhurried confidence of a machine that would not be requisitioned for anything else. "How long is this country?" Liesel asked Marsh, turning from the window. Marsh looked up from his clipboard. "How do you mean?" "I mean, how long until we reach the camp? How far are we traveling?" "Camp is in Illinois," Marsh said. "We'll be on this train until tomorrow morning." Liesel turned back to the window. "Tomorrow morning," she repeated quietly. "It is a large country," Marsh said, with the slight shrug of a man stating something so obvious he had never previously needed to state it. "How large?" Hilda asked. Marsh considered. "About 30 times the size of Germany, give or take." The car was quiet for a moment. 30 times, Marta said from the back. It was not a question. It was the sound of a person writing a number in a column and staring at it. "More or less," Marsh said. "I was never great at geography." Ingrid had been listening without turning from the window. Now she said, carefully, "Size is not strength. A large empty country is still empty." "Sure," Marsh said, with the easy agreement of someone who did not feel the need to argue. "Though it doesn't look very empty from here." Ingrid did not respond to that. They stopped briefly at a small station around noon. Marsh disappeared for 10 minutes, and came back with a paper bag that he set on the seat beside him and began distributing from without ceremony. Sandwiches wrapped in paper. An apple each. A small waxed cardboard container of cold milk. Liesel unwrapped her sandwich and looked at it. White bread, thick cut, with meat and a leaf of lettuce and something yellow that turned out to be a mild cheese. She took a bite and chewed slowly and looked at the wrapper. "This is from the station?" she asked. "Counter inside," Marsh said. "They make them fresh." "How much did it cost?" Marsh named a price in cents. Liesel did the conversion in her head, and her expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just the small recalibration of someone whose arithmetic has produced an unexpected result. "That is very cheap," she said. "Regular price," Marsh said. "Same as always." Ruth had already eaten half her sandwich with the efficient attention of a nurse fueling herself between tasks. She looked at the milk container, read the label on the side with brief interest, and drank it without comment. Marta ate everything completely and folded her wrapper into a neat square and held it in her hand, because there was nowhere to put it. Then she looked at Marsh. "The bread is real," she said. "What do you mean?" Marsh asked. "I mean it is made from flour," Marta said. "Only flour. You can tell by how it tears." Marsh looked at his own sandwich as though this distinction had never previously occurred to him. "I guess so," he said. "In Germany," Marta said, "the bread has had other things in it for 2 years. To make the flour last longer. Wood fiber, sometimes. Sawdust, in some places, toward the end." She said it without bitterness, simply as a fact being reported. "This is real bread." Marsh had no answer to that. He looked at his sandwich, then out the window, then back at his clipboard, and said nothing. Ingrid had eaten in silence with her eyes forward. Now she said, quietly and precisely, "One good meal on a train does not tell you anything about a country." "No," Hilda agreed. "One meal tells you nothing." She looked out the window at another farm passing, another full silo, another tractor under an open shed. "But I have been counting since New Jersey, and the count is telling me something." "What are you counting?" Liesel asked. "Everything," Hilda said. The afternoon deepened, and the light changed, and the farms kept coming. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, the train passed through the edge of a city whose name Hilda did not catch from the station sign, but whose skyline appeared in the window with a suddenness that made Liesel draw a short breath beside her. Factories. Not one or two, a district of them, running along the river that curved through the southern edge of the city, their smokestacks producing the steady gray output of facilities operating at full capacity. Loading docks extended into the water where barges waited. Rail lines ran directly into the largest buildings, emerging on the other side with flat cars stacked with crated equipment that Hilda could not identify at this distance, but that had the dimensions of machinery. "What do they make there?" Liesel asked Marsh. Marsh looked out the window. "That stretch? Aircraft components, I think. Some of it's automotive. They converted the lines at the start of the war. And the big one on the river does steel. All of those buildings are running." Hilda asked. "Far as I know," Marsh said. "They run 3 shifts. Day, evening, night." 3 shifts, Hilda said. Every day, Marsh confirmed, with the mildness of a man describing weather. Hilda turned back to the window and watched the factory district pass. She thought about the supply reports she had processed in Munich in the last year of her posting. The requisitions that came back unfilled, the allocation figures that declined each quarter with the steady arithmetic of a system that was consuming itself faster than it could be replenished. She thought about the notes she had made in the margins of those reports, the small professional observations of a woman who understood numbers and could see in them the shape of something that was not going to end well. She had written those notes carefully, in language that described variance and shortfall rather than collapse, because the language of collapse was not permitted. But the numbers said what the language could not. These factories did not have that quality. These factories had the quality of a system that had not yet been asked to run at its limit. "Hilda," Liesel said quietly beside her. "Yes. Are you still counting?" Hilda looked at the last of the factory buildings as they slipped behind the train. The river curved away. The city contracted back into suburbs, then fields, then the long and patient American countryside resuming its westward extension as though the factories had been simply one more thing it contained among many. "Yes," she said. "I am still counting." She did not say what the count was producing. But in the small notebook she kept in the inner pocket of her jacket, she had been writing figures since morning. Factories, silos, cars, farms, trucks, freight trains on parallel lines. And the column was growing in a direction that she was not yet ready to show anyone. Not because it was uncertain, because it was not. The train arrived at the camp transfer station in central Illinois at 7 in the morning, and the first thing Hilda noticed was the light. Not the quality of it. October light in the Midwest was not dramatically different from October light in Bavaria. But the quantity. Street lamps still burning as dawn came up. Windows lit in every building along the platform. A signal tower at the end of the yard blazing with electric light as though electricity were something that simply flowed without end from an inexhaustible source, which, she was beginning to understand, was precisely what it was here. In Munich, in the last 2 winters, electricity had come in rotations. For hours on, for hours off, sometimes less. Households learned the schedule and organized themselves around it, cooking during the on hours, sleeping through the off hours, keeping candles ready for the gaps. It had become so normal that normal was no longer the right word. It had become the texture of life, the way cold became the texture of winter when the coal ran out. Here the lights simply stayed on. A military bus waited beside the platform. They were the only passengers disembarking at this stop. 5 women and Marsh, with their small bags and the careful posture of people who had learned not to make themselves conspicuous. Two American guards who had been posted at the station's entrance watched them board with the mild alertness of men performing a routine task on a quiet morning. The bus drove west for 40 minutes through countryside that continued to behave exactly as it had through the train window. Farms, fields, equipment, silos, the whole unbroken fabric of a landscape that had no idea it was supposed to look exhausted. Liesel had fallen asleep against the window before they left the station and did not wake until the bus slowed at the camp gate. She blinked, looked out at the double fence and the guard towers, and said, "Are we there?" "We are there," Hilda said. Camp Ellis, Illinois was not what any of them had imagined, which was itself no longer surprising. The capacity for American reality to diverge from expectation had been established thoroughly enough on the train that Hilda had begun simply observing rather than comparing. Comparing required a fixed point of reference, and the fixed point she had carried from Germany was no longer reliable enough to use. The camp occupied several hundred acres of flat, Illinois land. A double perimeter fence ran its boundary, and guard towers stood at intervals, but the towers had the quality of structures built to observe rather than to menace, functional, bureaucratic, present without drama. Inside the fence, the barracks were wooden buildings in long rows, each with windows, each connected to the others by gravel paths that had been maintained against the autumn mud. A central building with a flagpole served as administration. Beside it stood a medical facility, a mess hall, and a low building whose sign Hilda could not read from the bus, but which Marsh told them was the camp library and education center. A library, in a prisoner of war camp, in the middle of Illinois. Hilda wrote it in her notebook without comment. Processing took 2 hours. A medical examination by an American doctor who was thorough and impersonal in equal measure. He checked Marta's hands, which had developed sores from the recent weeks of rough conditions, and immediately applied sulfa cream from a tin that looked new, then wrapped them in clean bandages without remarking on it, as though properly treating a prisoner's wounds were simply the obvious thing to do because it was. Photographs were taken. Forms were filled. A female American officer with gray-streaked hair and the bearing of a woman who had been managing large groups of people for most of her professional life walked them through the camp regulations in German that was slow but accurate, reading from a printed card. "You will receive 3 meals per day matching standard American military ration levels," she read. "Medical care is available at the facility you passed on your left. Mail will be received and sent weekly, subject to security review. You may request books from the camp library. Educational correspondence courses are available through the University of Illinois program. Voluntary work details are available for those who wish to earn camp currency." She lowered the card and looked at them. "Are there questions?" Ingrid, who had stood through the entire processing with the stillness of someone conserving energy for a confrontation she had not yet identified, said, "What is the purpose of offering education courses to prisoners?" The officer looked at her without particular surprise, as though this were a question she had been asked before. "Same purpose as offering them to anyone else," she said. "People who are learning something are less trouble than people who aren't." Ingrid held her gaze for a moment. "And the library?" "Same reason," the officer said. She picked up her folder and moved toward the door with the air of a woman who had a great deal more to do before noon. "Someone will show you to your barracks." The barracks room assigned to the 5 of them was 10 feet wide and 20 feet long, with 5 cots, 5 wooden chairs, 5 small lockers, a window at each end, and a cast iron radiator along the south wall that produced a steady, reliable heat that Hilda stood beside for a full minute with her palms against it, feeling the warmth move up her arms, because she had not been reliably warm since France. Liesel sat on her cot and pressed both hands into the mattress. "It has give," she said. "It's a real mattress," Marta said, sitting on her own and testing it with the practical attention she gave to all surfaces she was about to spend time on. "There are curtains," Liesel said, looking at the windows. "Why would they put curtains in a prisoner barracks?" "Why would they put a mattress?" Ruth said quietly, from the back of the room where she was examining the contents of her locker. "Is the same question." Ingrid had gone to the window and was looking out at the camp grounds with her arms folded. She said nothing for a moment. Then, "This is psychological. All of it. Make the prisoners comfortable. Make them weak. Make them feel they owe something. It is a strategy." "Perhaps," Hilda said. She was sitting on her cot with her notebook open and her pencil in her hand. "Or it is simply what they can afford." "No one does this simply because they can afford it," Ingrid said. "I am not sure that is true," Hilda said. "I think some countries do things because they can afford them without needing a further reason. The question is how they can afford it." She looked down at her notebook. "That is what I am trying to understand." Ingrid turned from the window and looked at her. "You have been writing in that notebook since New Jersey." "Yes." "What are you writing?" "Figures," Hilda said. "Observations." Things I would have noted in a supply report. And what do the figures say? Hilda was quiet for a moment. Outside, across the campgrounds, a group of prisoners from an earlier intake were moving between buildings with the unhurried pace of people who had established a routine. A guard walked the perimeter path at a distance, hands behind his back, in no apparent hurry. I am not ready to say yet, Hilda said. I need more observations. Dinner that first evening was served in the mess hall at 6 o'clock, and it arrived with the same quality of stubborn normalcy that everything else in America seemed to carry. The quality of a thing happening because it simply happened here. Unremarkable, routine, requiring no special explanation. Beef stew. Real beef, not the gristle and flour variety that German military kitchens had been producing since 1942, but actual meat in actual broth with potatoes and carrots that had not been dehydrated or reconstituted. White bread on a plate in the center of the table, a full loaf for every 4 people. Butter in a small dish. Coffee that smelled like coffee. And pie. An American orderly set a slice of apple pie in front of each woman with the efficiency of a person performing a task he performed every evening, and Liesel stared at it with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on something that was not quite happiness and not quite distress, but contained elements of both. This is dessert, she said. They serve dessert. Every meal has a dessert, said a voice from down the table. They looked up. A German woman from an earlier intake had spoken, a broad-faced woman in her 30s with tired eyes and the careful manner of someone who had been in the camp long enough to have processed most of her own surprises. Her name, they would learn, was Gerda. She had been a communications officer captured in Italy and had been at Camp Ellis for 3 months. Every meal, Liesel said. Breakfast has sweet rolls sometimes, Gerda said. Lunch has cookies. Dinner has pie or cake or pudding. Every day. She said it without wonder. The wonder had clearly worn off some time ago, but with a residue of something that had not quite gone away. You stop being surprised after a while, but you never entirely stop noticing. How is this possible? Liesel said, not quite as a question. I asked the same thing, Gerda said. A guard told me it was just the standard ration. Same as what American soldiers get in the field. She paused. He said it as though that were a normal thing to say. Ingrid had been eating with her eyes on her plate. Now she said, the Japanese do the same thing. Make prisoners comfortable to break their resistance. It is documented. Gerda looked at her. I thought that too, she said. For the first month, I waited for the real treatment to begin. The punishment underneath the kindness. She picked up her coffee cup. It never came. After 3 months, I have concluded that either they are very patient or there is no punishment underneath. And I am no longer certain which possibility frightens me more. The table was quiet for a moment. Ruth, who had eaten steadily through the entire conversation without contributing to it, set down her spoon and said, what frightens you about there being no punishment? Gerda looked at her. Because if there is no punishment, she said, then this is simply how they treat people. And if this is simply how they treat people, she stopped. Then the propaganda was wrong, Ruth said. Yes, Gerda said. Then the propaganda was wrong. That night, after lights out, Hilda lay on her cot in the dark and listened to the sounds of the camp settling. The distant footsteps of the perimeter guard, the creak of the barracks in the October wind, the slow breathing of the women around her finding sleep one by one. She did not sleep. She opened her notebook and in the thin light that came through the curtain window from the camp's exterior lamps, the lamps that stayed on all night, because here electricity did not come in rotations. She looked at the column she had been building since New Jersey. Factories along the river. At minimum 6 major facilities visible from the train, running 3 shifts. Freight trains counted on parallel lines heading east, 22 in a single afternoon. Farms between New Jersey and Illinois. She had lost count somewhere in Pennsylvania, but the number was large, and each one had been intact and operating. Cars observed in civilian driveways and station parking areas. More than she had seen in Munich in the last 2 years combined. The bread on the train, real flour. The stew at dinner, real meat. The pie, made with actual sugar. She turned to a fresh page and wrote a single line at the top. What is the gap between what we were told and what is true? Below it she began writing figures, arranging them in the columns she knew, the columns she had used for 3 years to describe what a region had, and what it needed, and what the difference between those 2 numbers meant for the people living inside it. The column she was building now described something she did not yet have a word for. It was too large for a word she currently owned. It would require a new one, or perhaps an old one applied in a new direction. She wrote for an hour. Then she closed the notebook and lay in the dark and thought about the lights that stayed on all night in a country that had not been asked yet to turn them off. Outside, America was quiet and enormous and completely unconcerned. It had been here the whole time. 3 weeks into camp life. The The women had developed the particular rhythm that captivity imposes on people whether they want it or not. Roll call at 6. Breakfast at 6:30. The morning hours were open. Prisoners could use the library, attend the educational sessions that a rotating group of American instructors offered in the central building, or simply sit in the barracks and wait for time to pass. Lunch at noon. Afternoons brought the option of voluntary work details, laundry, kitchen assistance, garden maintenance, administrative tasks that the camp's clerical staff occasionally needed extra hands for. Dinner at 6. Lights out at 10. It was, Hilda observed in her notebook, a more organized daily structure than she had maintained during the last 8 months of her Wehrmacht posting, when the collapse of the supply system she managed had made every day an improvisation against a backdrop of accelerating shortage. Ingrid refused the work details on principle for the first 2 weeks. She spent her mornings in the barracks reading from a German novel she had carried from France, her afternoons walking the perimeter of the inner compound with the measured pace of someone who had decided that controlled physical activity was the appropriate response to captivity. She spoke to the American staff only when necessary, and to the other women with a precision that had begun to take on the quality of a person choosing each word carefully, because she was no longer entirely certain what the words meant. Liesel, by contrast, had volunteered for the library detail on the 3rd day, because the library had English-language magazines with photographs and Liesel had decided that understanding the photographs would eventually lead to understanding the language, which she was approaching with the fearless imprecision of someone who has not yet learned to be embarrassed by mistakes. She returned each afternoon with new observations delivered in a rapid, slightly breathless manner that suggested she had been saving them up since morning. They have a magazine, she told Hilda one afternoon, setting 3 issues on the cot beside her, that is entirely about houses. Just houses. Photographs of houses with descriptions of the furniture inside them and how much everything costs. An entire magazine, every month, only about houses and the things that go inside houses. What kinds of houses? Hilda asked. Regular ones, Liesel said. Not palaces. Not estates. Regular houses for regular people. But the kitchens. She opened one of the magazines to a full-page photograph and held it out. Look at that kitchen. Hilda looked. The kitchen in the photograph had a refrigerator, a gas range with 4 burners, a double sink, cabinets running the full length of 2 walls, a small breakfast table with 4 chairs, a window above the sink with a curtain in a pattern of small yellow flowers. A bowl of fruit sat on the counter. The caption below described the refrigerator's capacity and the range's features and noted that the total cost of the kitchen renovation had been $900, which the article described as affordable for the average American family. Hilda stared at the photograph for a long moment. Average, she said. That is what it says, Liesel confirmed. Average American family. That is their average kitchen. Marta leaned over from her cot and looked at the photograph. She studied it for a moment with the specific attention of a woman who had cooked on a wood stove in a farmhouse kitchen that had not changed substantially since her grandmother's time. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling and said nothing. What does the refrigerator do? Liesel asked. I know what it does. I have seen one before, in a hotel in Munich. But do regular people use them every day? Regular people in America apparently have one in their kitchen, Hilda said. According to this magazine. So the food stays cold, Liesel said. Always. You just open the door and everything is cold. Yes. In summer too. In summer too. Liesel sat with this for a moment. Then she said, in summer at home, my mother kept butter in a clay pot in the cellar because it was the coolest place. She checked it every morning. Sometimes it went bad anyway. She looked at the photograph again. An entire machine just to keep the butter cold. Not just the butter, Marta said from her cot, still looking at the ceiling. Everything. Meat. Milk. Vegetables. Everything cold, all the time, without thinking about it. The room was quiet for a moment. From the window, the sound of the camp afternoon came through. Voices, a distant truck engine, the dry scrape of boots on gravel. It is propaganda, Ingrid said from behind her novel. The magazine is produced to make the enemy look strong, to demoralize prisoners. It is a decorating magazine, Liesel said. It is about curtain patterns. Even so, Ingrid said. Ingrid, Liesel said, with the gentle directness of someone who is 19 and has not yet learned the social cost of stating the obvious. We ate apple pie last night. The night before it was chocolate pudding. This morning there were sweet rolls at breakfast. If this is propaganda, it is the most expensive propaganda in the history of warfare. Ingrid turned a page of her novel and said nothing. The Eleanor problem, as Hilda privately came to think of it, began in the 4th week. Eleanor Marsh, no relation to Corporal Danny Marsh, a coincidence that Liesel found remarkable and everyone else found unremarkable, was a Red Cross volunteer from Decatur, Illinois, who visited the camp every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. She was 38 years old, with brown hair going gray at the temples and the particular manner of a woman who had been competent for so long that competence had become invisible to her, simply the way she moved through rooms. Her official role was welfare visits, checking on the prisoner's general condition, distributing donated items from the Red Cross parcels, answering questions about mail procedures and family contact services. In practice, she was also the person the camp administration sent when they needed something explained to the women's section in language that felt human rather than institutional, which happened more often than the official procedures acknowledged. She spoke no German. Marsh translated, when he was available, when he was not. Eleanor and whichever prisoner she was speaking with managed with a combination of slow English, gesture, and the particular patience of two people who have decided that communication is worth the effort. Hilda had watched her for 2 weeks before they spoke directly. She watched the way Eleanor moved through the barracks common room, setting donated items on the table with the unhurried efficiency of someone performing an act of practical charity rather than a demonstration of anything. No performance of generosity, no watching for gratitude, just the distribution of goods to people who needed them, because that was what she was here to do. She watched the quality of Eleanor's clothing. Not expensive. A wool coat that had been resold more than once, a scarf that was worn at the edges, flat shoes with sensible heels. But intact. Clean. The clothing of a woman who maintained what she had, which was different from a woman who had nothing to maintain. She watched Eleanor's hands when she wrote things down on her clipboard, the handwriting of a person who wrote a great deal, fast and clear, the handwriting of someone with a job that involved paperwork. On a Thursday in November, when Marsh was occupied with a processing intake on the other side of camp and Eleanor arrived to find no interpreter available, she came to Hilda directly. "I hear you speak some English," she said. Hilda's English was functional rather than fluent, built from 3 years of processing Allied supply documents that arrived in her office through various intelligence channels. "Some," she said carefully. "Not well. Better than my German," Eleanor said, with the mild smile of someone making a small joke rather than a claim. "I just need to ask a few questions for the welfare report. Is that all right?" "Yes," Hilda said. "That is all right." They sat at the table in the common room, Eleanor with her clipboard and Hilda with her hands folded, and Eleanor asked her standard questions: general health, any medical concerns, any issues with mail delivery, any problems with the barracks conditions, and Hilda answered them in the careful English of someone thinking one word ahead of the one she was speaking. When Eleanor had finished her form, she put the clipboard on the table and looked at Hilda with the direct but non-aggressive attention of a woman who was genuinely curious rather than strategically probing. "You were a supply clerk," she said. "Before? In Germany?" "Yes. For a district cooperative. Food allocation. That must have been difficult work," Eleanor said. Toward the end, Hilda looked at her. The observation was precise in a way she had not expected from a welfare volunteer. "Yes," she said. "It was difficult. I work in procurement," Eleanor said. "For the county agricultural office. Not military, civilian. Coordinating food distribution between farms and processing facilities. I imagine we did opposite versions of the same job." Hilda was quiet for a moment. "What does your work look like now?" she asked. "During the war. Busier than before," Eleanor said. "More coordination needed because so many men are away. But the supply side is, honestly, the supply side is not the problem. The farms are producing more than before the war in most categories. The challenge is moving it efficiently." She said it with the slight weariness of a professional describing a logistical challenge, not a crisis. "We have too much in some places and not enough in others, and the trick is matching them up. But overall," she made a small gesture that suggested overall was not a word that required qualification. "Overall it is manageable." Hilda looked at her for a long moment. "In Germany," she said, "the challenge was the opposite. We did not have too much anywhere." Eleanor nodded slowly. She seemed to understand the weight of what Hilda was not saying. She did not comment on it. She simply acknowledged it with the quiet respect of a person who recognizes another person's reality without needing to do anything with it. "How long have you been doing this work?" Hilda asked. "The procurement. 12 years, Eleanor said. "Since I was 26. Before that I was a schoolteacher, but the county needed someone for the agricultural office and I had a head for numbers." "You have always worked," Hilda said. It was not a question exactly. More an observation being confirmed. "Of course," Eleanor said, with the slight puzzlement of someone who has never considered the alternative. "Hasn't everyone?" Hilda thought about the newsreels. The pamphlets. The carefully constructed image of American women as decorative figures in a society too soft and too comfortable to sustain itself under pressure. She thought about Vera Calloway running her farm alone in Kansas. She thought about Eleanor Marsh from Decatur, Illinois, 12 years in county agricultural procurement, head for numbers, sitting across a table in a prisoner of war camp common room, with a clipboard and flat shoes, and the easy authority of a woman who had been competent for so long she had forgotten it was remarkable. Yes, Hilda said. I suppose everyone has. That evening she found Ingrid in the barracks, seated at her small desk with the German novel closed beside her and her hands flat on the surface in front of her, looking at nothing. Hilda sat on her cot. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Ingrid said, without turning around, what did she say? The Red Cross woman. She works in county agricultural procurement, Hilda said. She has done it for 12 years. Before that she was a schoolteacher. A working woman, Ingrid said. That is not unusual. German women work too. She said the farms in her county are producing more than before the war, Hilda said. She said the supply side is not the problem. She said the challenge is moving too much efficiently. Ingrid's hands pressed slightly flatter against the desk surface. Too much, she said. That was the word she used, Hilda said. Too much in some places. Not the word shortage. Not the word reduction. Too much. The radiator ticked steadily in the corner. Outside, the evening guard change was happening. Voices, boot steps, the brief mechanical sound of the gate. She could be lying, Ingrid said. Her voice had changed slightly. Not in volume. In certainty. Something in it was working harder than it had been an hour ago. She could be, Hilda agreed. But she was describing a logistics problem. A professional problem about distribution efficiency. People do not invent logistics problems to impress their enemies. It is not that kind of lie. Ingrid said nothing for a long time. Then, very quietly, almost to herself, too much. Yes, Hilda said. She opened her notebook and wrote Eleanor's words down in the column that had been growing since New Jersey. The column that was becoming, whether she wanted it to or not, a document of something she would eventually have to name. Outside, the camp lights came on for the evening. They came on without hesitation, without rotation, without the brief flicker of a system running at the edge of its capacity. They simply came on. Because here, that was what lights did. Eleanor came back the following Thursday, and the Thursday after that, and by the third visit it had become understood between her and Hilda that they would sit at the common room table after the official welfare questions were finished, and talk for whatever time remained before Eleanor had to drive back to Decatur. The conversations were not political. Neither of them steered them that way, and neither of them needed to, because the political content arrived on its own through the ordinary details of Eleanor's life, the way water finds its level without being directed. Eleanor talked about her work the way professionals talk about work they have done long enough to see its full shape, with the specific authority of someone who knows where the problems are and has opinions about the solutions. She described the coordination challenges between the county's grain producers and the processing facilities in Peoria, the bottleneck at the rail yard that backed up shipments every October when the harvest peak collided with the military's increased freight demands, the committee she sat on that was trying to address it. She talked about her house, which she owned, not rented, a distinction she mentioned without emphasis, simply as a fact of her situation, on a street in Decatur with 3 bedrooms, a yard, and a furnace that had required repair the previous winter, which she had organized herself because her husband was in the Pacific with the Navy and there was no one else to organize it. She talked about her car, a 1941 Ford that she drove to the camp and to her office and to the grocery store on Saturday mornings, and which needed new rear tires before winter, but was otherwise in good condition. She talked about the grocery store. This was the conversation that Hilda found herself returning to afterward, writing about in her notebook with the careful precision she brought to figures that required accurate recording. It had started simply. Eleanor had mentioned, in passing, that the Saturday morning grocery run was taking longer now because the store had reorganized its layout, and she kept finding things in the wrong place. Hilda had asked, without planning to, what the store looked like. Eleanor had described it. An aisle for canned goods. An aisle for dry goods, flour, sugar, coffee, oats, rice. An aisle for household items. A refrigerated section at the back for dairy and meat. Fresh produce along the left wall, restocked 3 times a week from regional farms. A bakery counter with bread baked on the premises each morning. How large is this store? Hilda asked. Eleanor thought about it. Maybe 6 times this room, she said, gesturing at the common room around them. Something like that. It is not the biggest one in Decatur. There is a larger one on the east side. And the shelves, Hilda said. They are full. Mostly, Eleanor said. Some things are rationed. Sugar, butter, meat, coffee. You need ration stamps. But the shelves are not empty. The store has what it normally carries, just limited in how much one person can buy at once. In Germany, Hilda said carefully, the shelves have been empty for 2 years. The ration stamps often cannot be used because the goods the stamps are for do not exist in the stores. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. I didn't know it had gotten that bad, she said. Most people did not, Hilda said. The official communications did not describe it that way. No, Eleanor said. I imagine they wouldn't. They sat with that for a moment. Then Eleanor said, my mother calls the rationing here an inconvenience. She complains about the butter stamps. She has a friend who keeps chickens and trades eggs for extra butter, which is technically not legal, but everyone does it. She paused. I think about that sometimes. That our version of hardship is that my mother can't buy as much butter as she would like and has to negotiate with a neighbor's chickens. Hilda looked at her. She did not say anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. The distance between Eleanor's mother's butter problem and the empty shelves of Munich in 1944 was not a distance that words could adequately describe. It was a distance that belonged in a column of figures, where the gap between two numbers speaks for itself. She reported the conversation to the others that evening as she always did, sitting on her cot with her notebook open, reading her notes aloud in the flat and careful manner of someone presenting a supply report rather than editorializing about its contents. Liesel listened with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes wide. Marta listened with her eyes on her hands. Ruth listened from the back of the room, still and attentive, the way she listened to everything. Ingrid sat at her desk with her back to the room, which was itself a form of listening. When Hilda finished, Liesel said, she owns her house. Yes. A woman who works for the county agricultural office owns her own house. Yes. In Decatur, Illinois. Liesel seemed to be testing the name of the place against the reality it contained, finding the fit improbable. Not a rich woman. A regular working woman. And she owns a house and a car, and drives herself to a grocery store with full shelves, and her biggest problem is finding the flour in the new aisle. That is approximately correct, Hilda said. Marta said, without looking up from her hands. What was the farm worker's name? The one you met at the camp. Gerda, Ruth said. No, the American. The guard's family. Morrison, Hilda said. Corporal Morrison, that was on the train. We haven't met his equivalent here yet. We have Eleanor, Ruth said. Yes, Hilda said. We have Eleanor. Ingrid had turned slightly in her chair. Not fully around. She had not turned fully around in a conversation for 3 weeks, but enough to indicate she was participating rather than simply enduring. A county agricultural office, she said. Not private industry. A government office. Yes, Hilda said. So it is public sector employment, Ingrid said. The government employs her. That is not so different. She has done it for 12 years, Hilda said. She chose it. She was a schoolteacher first and changed because she preferred the other work. She looked at her notes. She described choosing between two jobs as though choosing between two jobs were something a person simply did. The room was quiet. My cousin wanted to be a chemist, Liesel said, after a moment. She was very good at science at school. But women did not go to university for chemistry. She became a secretary. She paused. She is a very good secretary. But she wanted to be a chemist. Nobody commented on this. It sat in the room alongside everything else that had been accumulating since New Jersey, taking up the space it needed. The work detail that changed things for Marta began in the 5th week. She had volunteered for kitchen assistance on the 3rd day and had remained on it ever since. Not from enthusiasm, but from the practical logic of a woman who would rather be doing something with her hands than sitting in a barracks waiting for time to pass. The camp kitchen was run by a civilian contractor, an arrangement that had initially surprised her, and staffed by a combination of American workers and prisoner volunteers. The head cook was a man named Gerald, 55, from Bloomington, who had cooked for a hotel before the war and had moved to camp kitchen management when the hotel's clientele evaporated with the fuel rationing. He was a precise and unsentimental cook who cared about food the way mechanics care about engines, not with sentiment, but with professional respect for what things were supposed to do and satisfaction when they did it. He and Marta had established a working relationship built on the universal language of people who understand kitchens, the language of preparation sequence and timing, and the specific shorthand of a professional workspace, where efficiency is more important than conversation. One morning in early November, a delivery arrived. Marta was at the prep counter when the kitchen's back door opened and 2 American workers began bringing in crates. Gerald checked them against a delivery list, moving between crates with his clipboard, calling out contents as he went. Marta listened while she worked. 40 pounds of beef, 30 dozen eggs, 20 pounds of butter, 50 pounds of potatoes, 30 pounds of carrots, 20 pounds of onions, 15 pounds of dried beans, 10 pounds of coffee, 40 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of sugar, 12 cans of lard, 8 crates of canned tomatoes, 6 crates of canned corn, apples, 2 bushels, fresh. Gerald checked the last crate, signed the delivery sheet, and went back to his prep station. Marta stood at the counter and did not move for a moment. She was doing arithmetic. The arithmetic of a woman who had managed a farm's food supply, who had submitted and received rationing allocations, who understood in the precise and personal way of direct experience exactly what these quantities represented in terms of people fed and days sustained. This delivery, this single weekly delivery for one camp kitchen, exceeded the monthly allocation for a residential district of 400 people in Munich in the winter of 1943. She picked up her knife and went back to work. At lunch, she sat beside Hilda in the mess hall and said nothing for several minutes. Then she said, "I need to tell you something about the kitchen delivery." Hilda took out her notebook. Marta recited the quantities from memory, because she had a farmer's memory for amounts, the kind of memory built by years of calculating exactly how much feed a herd needed and how many weeks the hay would last. She recited them flatly, without commentary. Hilda wrote them down. Then she looked at her notebook and did a calculation in the margin. Then she was quiet. "What does it tell you?" Marta asked. "It tells me," Hilda said slowly, "that this camp, which holds 550 prisoners, receives enough food each week to have fed my entire supply district in Munich for a month. In 1943, she looked up, and the camp kitchen staff told me last week that food cost is not the largest budget line. The largest budget line is personnel." Marta looked at her food. "Not food," she said. "Personnel. They spend more on the people running the camp than on feeding the prisoners," Hilda said. "Because the food is not expensive enough to be the largest cost." Marta picked up her fork. She ate slowly and carefully, the way she had eaten every meal since captivity, the ingrained habit of a person who had learned not to waste what was in front of her, because tomorrow might bring less. Except that tomorrow, here, would not bring less. Tomorrow would bring the same delivery. And the week after. And the week after that. Because this was not a system running at the edge of its margin. This was a system that did not currently know where its margin was, because it had never been close enough to it to find out. "I need to tell Ingrid," Marta said. "Yes," Hilda said. "I think you should be the one to tell her." That evening after dinner, Marta told Ingrid. She did it the same way she did everything, directly, without preamble, sitting down across from her in the barracks and reciting the delivery figures the same way she had recited them to Hilda, flat and precise, the numbers speaking for themselves without editorial assistance. Ingrid listened with her hands folded on the desk in front of her. She did not interrupt. When Marta finished, she was quiet for a long time. The barracks was mostly empty. Liesel was at the library for an evening reading program. Ruth was in the medical facility helping with a minor procedure. Hilda was at the common room table writing in her notebook. "Those figures could be inflated," Ingrid said finally. "For show. To impress the prisoners." "I watched the delivery come in," Marta said. "I watched Gerald check it against the list. I watched the kitchen workers store it. It was not a performance. It was a Tuesday morning delivery. Nobody was watching except me, and nobody knew I was calculating." Ingrid looked at her hands. "The farms I saw from the train," Marta continued. "I know farms. I know what a farm looks like when it is producing at full capacity and what it looks like when it is being stripped for the war effort. The farms I saw from that train window were not being stripped. They had their equipment. They had their livestock. They were producing normally." She paused. "More than normally. Better equipment than most German farms had even before the war." "Marta," Ingrid began. "I know what you were going to say," Marta said quietly. "I said it to myself for 3 weeks. I am still saying parts of it. But the delivery figures are what they are. And my eyes on that train were what they were. And the bread we eat every day is made from real flour." She stood up. "I am not asking you to believe anything. I am telling you what I saw and what I counted. What you do with it is your business." She went to her cot and lay down and looked at the ceiling. Ingrid sat at her desk for a long time after that, her hands flat on the surface in front of her, not moving. The radiator ticked. The lights stayed on. Outside, America went on being what it was, enormous and indifferent and completely, quietly, devastatingly intact. December came to Illinois with a cold that was different from European cold. It was flatter, more total, a cold that came across the open plains without interruption and pressed against the barracks walls with the patient persistence of something that had been traveling a long distance and had arrived without hurry. The camp heating system responded without drama. The radiators in the barracks ran continuously. The mess hall was warm enough that some prisoners ate in their shirt sleeves. The library maintained a temperature that allowed prolonged reading without a coat. Hilda noted this in her notebook on the first truly cold day, not because it was unexpected anymore, but because it remained, in its quiet way, a fact that required recording. A prisoner of war camp in the interior of America, heated continuously through an Illinois winter, because the system that supplied the heat had not been asked to choose between heating prisoners and heeding something more important. There was nothing more important to divert it to. That was the conclusion she had been approaching since New Jersey, the one she had been circling in her notebook for 7 weeks without writing directly, the way a surveyor circles a fixed point from multiple angles before finally driving the stake. She had measured it from the train window. She had measured it in Eleanor's grocery store description and the kitchen delivery figures and the magazine photographs and the lights that stayed on all night. She had measured it in Marsh's casual observation that the country was 30 times the size of Germany, delivered with the slight shrug of a man stating something so obvious he had never previously needed to state it. She had all the measurements now. She knew what they said. She had known for 2 weeks. She had simply not written it yet, because writing it would make it the kind of true that could not be made less true by further observation. On the first Sunday of December, she wrote it. The gap between what we were told and what is true is not a matter of degree. It is not that the propaganda exaggerated certain strengths or minimized certain weaknesses. The gap is total. We were not fighting a desperate enemy. We were fighting a country that had not yet been asked to try. She read it back twice. Then she closed the notebook and sat on her cot for a long time with her hands in her lap, looking at nothing. The Christmas announcement came 2 weeks before the holiday. The camp commander, a colonel named Arthur Webb, gathered the women's section in the mess hall on a Wednesday morning and spoke to them in the measured and impersonal tone of a man delivering institutional information rather than personal sentiment. His German was delivered through an interpreter, a young lieutenant who had studied the language at university and spoke it with the slight over-precision of an academic rather than the rough functionality of Marsh. On December 25th, the interpreter translated, "The camp will observe a holiday schedule. There will be religious services in the morning, both Catholic and Protestant, led by the prisoners' own chaplains in the main hall. Attendance is voluntary. The afternoon is unstructured. In the evening, there will be a special dinner." He paused while the colonel said something further. "The menu for the Christmas dinner will be posted on the mess hall board 3 days in advance," the interpreter continued. "The Red Cross has provided supplementary items for each prisoner, a small package that will be distributed Christmas morning. Mail delivery this week includes a special holiday processing that may bring letters from home more quickly than the usual schedule." He stopped. Colonel Webb looked at the room for a moment with the neutral assessment of a man checking whether the information had been received, then nodded once and left. The women filed back to the barracks in the cold morning air. "Religious services," Liesel said, walking beside Hilda. "They let us have our own services. With our own chaplains." "Yes," Hilda said. "And a special dinner," Liesel said. "And packages." "Yes. And letters from home." "Liesel," Hilda said. "I know," Liesel said quietly. "I know. I keep saying the things out loud because they sound different when I say them out loud than when I think them." "What do they sound like when you say them out loud?" Liesel thought about it. "True," she said. "They sound true. And when I think them, something in me keeps trying to make them not true. But then I say them, and they are true. There is nothing to argue with." Hilda said nothing. She understood exactly what Liesel meant. The distance between a thought and a spoken sentence was the distance between a private doubt and an acknowledged fact. And acknowledged facts had a weight that private doubts could be shifted around indefinitely to avoid. 3 days before Christmas, the menu went up on the mess hall board. Roast turkey with gravy, mashed potatoes, glazed carrots, green beans, cranberry sauce, fresh dinner rolls with butter. For dessert, pumpkin pie with whipped cream. Coffee. Liesel read it twice, standing in front of the board with her hands in her pockets, and then came to find Hilda in the library. "Have you seen the menu?" she said. "I have seen it," Hilda said. "Turkey," Liesel said. "They are serving turkey to 500 prisoners." "Yes." "With pie." "Yes." "Hilda," Liesel said, sitting down across from her at the library table and lowering her voice. "My family in Stuttgart. My mother wrote in October that they had not seen butter in 2 months. That the bread ration had been reduced again. That my brother had lost 12 kilograms since the summer." She paused. "And we are having turkey with pie." Hilda looked at her. "I know," she said. "How do they do it?" Liesel said. It was not quite a question. It had the quality of something that had been a question for weeks and had gradually become something else. Not rhetorical exactly, but a sentence that had exhausted the possibility of a simple answer and was asking for the complicated one. It was controlled and quiet. And she had spent the afternoon in the barracks, not reading, not moving particularly, simply present in the way of someone whose internal work was occupying all available resources. Now she sat across the table with her turkey untouched and her hands in her lap, and looked at the candle at the center of the table. After a while Hilda said, quietly, "Ingrid." Ingrid looked up. "You should eat," Hilda said. "The food is real. It will not solve anything if you don't eat it." Ingrid looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at her plate. Then she picked up her fork with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision rather than performing an automatic action, and she ate. She ate everything on the plate. When the pie came, the pumpkin pie with whipped cream, delivered to each place by an orderly with the same professional indifference as everything else. Ingrid looked at it for a long time. Then she said, without looking up, in a voice that was very quiet and very even, "My sister in Nuremberg has 2 children. They are 6 and 8. She wrote in November that they had not had sugar in the house for 3 months. No one said anything. 6 and 8 years old, Ingrid said. No sugar for 3 months. She looked up. Her face was composed, controlled. The rigidity was still there in her posture, the trained straightness of a woman who had spent a decade learning to carry herself as a representation of something. But behind it, something had changed in a way that could not be reversed. And here we sit. Yes, Hilda said. Here we sit. I have been telling myself for 7 weeks, Ingrid said, that there was an explanation, that it was strategy, psychological warfare, that the abundance was manufactured for our benefit, that the real America was the one we were taught. She was quiet for a moment. But no country manufactures abundance of this scale for the psychological benefit of 500 female prisoners in Illinois. The cost alone would make it absurd. No, Hilda said. No country does that. Then it is real, Ingrid said. It is real, Hilda said. The candle between them burned steadily, without flicker, because the mess hall had no drafts, because the building was solidly constructed, because in this country even the temporary structures were built to last. Ingrid looked at her pie. She picked up her fork. She took one precise and deliberate bite, and chewed, and set the fork down. Then we were lied to, she said. Not as a question, not with anger, with the flat and final quality of a column of figures that has been checked twice, and cannot be argued with. Completely. About all of it. Yes, Hilda said. I believe we were. Ruth, who had not spoken through any of this, set down her coffee cup and said, the question now is what we do with knowing it. The table was quiet. We cannot say it aloud when we go home, Marta said. Not to everyone. Some people are not ready. Some people will never be ready. And some people will call it treason. Yes, Hilda said. So we carry it, Liesel said. It was not a complaint. It was the observation of a 19-year-old who had just understood something about the weight of knowing the truth in a world that has organized itself around a different version of it. We carry it alone. Not alone, Ruth said. She looked around the table, at Hilda with her notebook, at Marta with her farmer's hands and her kitchen arithmetic, at Liesel pressing the truth against the inside of her ribs like a thing she was learning to hold, at Ingrid sitting straight-backed, and altered, and irreversibly awake. We carry it together. We just cannot carry it loudly. Nobody spoke for a while after that. The mess hall moved around them. 500 prisoners, the possibility of a simple answer, and was asking for the complicated one. Do you want the real answer? Hilda said. Yes, Liesel said. I think I am ready for the real answer. Hilda opened her notebook to the page she had written on the first Sunday of December and turned it to face Liesel and let her read it. Liesel read it once. Then again. Then she looked up. Not yet been asked to try, she said quietly. No, Hilda said. Not yet. Meaning they could do more than this. Meaning this is not their limit, Hilda said. This is their routine. Liesel sat back in her chair and looked at the library ceiling for a long moment. Around them, other prisoners moved between shelves with the quiet purpose of people filling time with something useful. A guard sat near the door reading a newspaper. Through the library window, the December sky pressed flat and white against the glass. Then we never had a chance, Liesel said. Not with despair. With the specific flatness of a person arriving at a fact that has been true for a long time and is only now being acknowledged as such. No, Hilda said. I do not think we did. Christmas dinner arrived on the evening of December 25th with the same quality of unstudied abundance that everything in America seemed to carry. The quality of a thing that was happening because it happened here, because this was what the system produced when left to run normally, because there was no version of this country in which Christmas dinner for prisoners was a strain on resources worth remarking on. The mess hall had been arranged differently. White tablecloths on the long tables. Real cloth, not paper. Proper plates rather than metal trays. Actual silverware, heavy and solid in the hand. A cloth napkin folded at each place. A small candle at the center of each table, lit by an orderly who moved down the row with a lighter in the unhurried manner of someone doing a pleasant task. The 5 of them sat together, as they always did. Marsh had the evening off and had been replaced by a guard named Peterson who stood near the door with his hands behind his back and no particular expression. The food came out on serving platters carried by kitchen orderlies who moved between the tables with professional efficiency. Turkey sliced thick and placed on plates with the casual abundance of a kitchen that had more than enough. Potatoes spooned alongside. carrots glazed and steaming. A dinner roll placed on the bread plate at the top left of each setting with the automatic precision of someone who had been taught the correct position and maintained it even in a prisoner of war camp in central Illinois on Christmas night. Hilda sat with her hands on either side of her plate and looked at the food. She thought about her mother's kitchen in Munich. She thought about the last letter she had received, in October, which had described the current state of the city in the careful oblique language her mother used when she was trying not to cause alarm. The reference to the neighbor's house on the corner being gone now, the mention of the reduced opening hours at the market, the note that Hilda's sister had sent her coat to be resold and been told there was no leather available. She thought about the column in her notebook and the figure at the bottom of it and the sentence she had written on the first Sunday of December. She thought about the farms from the train window, all those weeks ago, continuing west in the October morning light, each one intact and producing, each one unremarkable to anyone who lived inside this world. She picked up her fork. Beside her, Liesel ate in silence, carefully, the way she always ate now, not with the desperate speed of the hungry, but with the particular attention of someone who understood that the meal in front of her represented something larger than itself and wanted to be present to it. Marta ate steadily, her eyes on her plate. She had said almost nothing since the conversation with Ingrid 2 weeks earlier, not from withdrawal, but from the quality of a person who has arrived at a conclusion that requires no further discussion and is simply living inside it now. Ruth ate with the economical attention she brought to everything. At some point during the meal, she looked up and around the room. At the other tables of prisoners eating in their white tablecloth mess hall, at the guards standing at the edges in their clean uniforms, at the orderlies moving between tables with serving platters. And her expression held the specific quality of a person filing a scene in permanent memory, the way nurses sometimes look at moments they know they will need to carry accurately for a long time. Ingrid had not spoken since they sat down. She had not spoken much since the conversation with Marta. She had attended the morning's Protestant service. Hilda had seen her there, standing straight at the back of the hall, singing the words of the hymns in a voice that was controlled. Would continue to feed them this way until the war ended, and they were sent home to whatever was left of the places they had come from. The guards stood at the edges of the room in their clean uniforms. The candles burned on the tables. The orderlies moved with their platters and their professional indifference, and their complete unawareness that at one particular table in the center of the room, something had finished being built and was now simply standing, complete, requiring no further addition. Later, back in the barracks, Hilda opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date. December 25th, 1944. Camp Ellis, Illinois. She thought for a moment. Then she wrote, "We came here believing we were fighting a country on the edge of collapse. We leave knowing we were fighting a country that had not yet been asked to try. The difference between those two things is the difference between a war that made sense and a war that never did. I do not know yet what to do with that, but I know I will spend the rest of my life doing something with it." She looked at the page for a moment. Then she wrote one more line. "The lights are still on." She closed the notebook and lay back on her cot, which had a real mattress, in a room with a working radiator, in a camp that would serve breakfast in the morning with the same unstudied abundance it had served every meal since October, in a country that was 30 times the size of Germany and had not yet been asked to try. Outside, the Illinois winter pressed flat and cold against the walls. Inside, the heat continued without interruption. Because here, that was simply what heat